The call came in on a Thursday afternoon at 2:17 p.m. A property inspection request flagged by the County Code Enforcement Office after a neighbor submitted a written complaint about what she described as irregular truck traffic at an industrial storage unit on the far end of Millward Business Park, a low-profile commercial complex on the eastern edge of Denton Falls. Population 9,400. A mid-sized county seat built around a regional agricultural processing hub, with a small manufacturing corridor along its eastern boundary, and the kind of downtown that still had a hardware store and a diner that had been serving the same breakfast special since 1987. The kind of town where most people had lived for 20 years or more, where the faces behind business counters were familiar, and where newcomers were noticed, not with suspicion, but with the natural attentiveness of a community small enough to track its own edges. The deputy assigned to the property inspection had been with the Denton Falls County Sheriff's Office for 7 years. Code enforcement assists were not glamorous work. They were, in the daily rhythm of the office, the functional equivalent of administrative errands. Go to an address, confirm or deny the complaint, document the findings, close the ticket. He had done dozens of them. He expected to do one more. Millward Business Park was a 12-unit commercial complex built in the late 90s to attract small, light industrial and storage tenants. It sat at the end of a county road about a mile and a half east of the town center, visible from the road, but not prominently so. A row of beige corrugated steel units behind a chain-link perimeter, with a shared parking apron and individual roll-up doors. Most of the units were occupied by the kinds of tenants that generated no particular attention. A landscaping equipment storage operation, a regional food distribution relay point, a small metal fabrication shop, a tile contractor's inventory facility, ordinary commercial activity, the kind of place a person could drive past for years without ever thinking about. The unit in question was number 7 at the far eastern end of the row. It had been leased for the previous 3 years under the name of a regional trade logistics company, officially registered as a freight coordination and customs documentation consulting firm. The registration listed the principal as a male in his early 50s, with a county address in a residential neighborhood about 2 miles from the business park. The business had paid its lease on time. It had no outstanding code violations on record. It had, as far as the county's commercial registry was concerned, existed for 3 years as a quiet, unremarkable small business operating in a quiet, unremarkable corner of a quiet, unremarkable commercial park. The neighbor who filed the complaint ran a landscape supply storage operation 2 units down. She had been a tenant at Millward Business Park for 9 years. She knew the park's rhythms, who came in when, what vehicles usually appeared on what days, which units generated activity, and which sat mostly dormant. Over the previous 6 weeks, she had observed a pattern at Unit 7 that she found inconsistent with the business profile she had always associated with it. Trucks, not large commercial semi-trucks, but mid-size cargo vans and panel trucks, the kind used for regional freight, arriving at irregular hours, sometimes in the early morning before the park's other tenants arrived, sometimes in the evening after most businesses had closed. The vehicles rarely had visible commercial markings. They stayed for varying periods, sometimes 30 minutes, sometimes several hours. They always left before the neighboring tenants generated much activity. She had not witnessed anything overtly alarming. She had simply noticed that it was wrong in the way that someone who had watched the same environment for 9 years notices when a pattern changes. The deputy arrived at Millward Business Park at 3:05 p.m. He parked at the main entrance and walked the apron toward Unit 7. The roll-up door was down and closed. A standard entry door to the left of the roll-up was closed, but he noticed as he approached, not fully latched. The latch bolt was not engaged, and the door moved slightly in a draft when he came near. He knocked. No response. He knocked again and identified himself. Still nothing. He stood back from the door and took stock of what he could observe from his position without entering. A faint sound from inside. Not mechanical, not ventilation. Paper. The soft, irregular sound of papers or plastic materials shifting in an interior space with air movement. And something else, the very faint trace of adhesive, the kind associated with packing materials and shipping supplies, not alarming in a freight coordination business, but present enough to register. He noted his observations, stepped back, and called the code enforcement supervisor to report the unlatched door and his general observations. Standard procedure when an entry door at a commercial property is found unsecured is to conduct a welfare and security check of the interior. The supervisor authorized it. The deputy pushed the door open, identified himself clearly, and stepped inside. The front section of Unit 7 was consistent with its registered business purpose. A desk, a filing cabinet, a commercial-grade laser printer and scanner, shelves along one wall bearing binders with freight documentation labels, shipping manifests, customs declaration forms, international freight correspondence, a whiteboard on the wall with freight routing notations in both English and Farsi. The deputy noted the Farsi without immediately assigning significance to it. Plenty of legitimate businesses in the region handled trade documentation for international clients, but the whiteboard was not what stopped him. Along the left wall of the unit's interior, partially obscured by a steel shelving unit that had been positioned to block the direct line of sight from the entry door, were stacked a quantity of sealed cardboard boxes bearing commercial shipping labels, not unusual in a freight documentation office, but also, stacked separately and without shipping labels, a series of flat, hard-sided cases of the kind used to transport electronic and optical equipment. 12 of them, stacked in 2 columns of 6. Each case was sealed with combination locks. Each bore a small adhesive label printed with an alphanumeric code in a format the deputy did not recognize as standard commercial freight notation. He did not touch anything. He stepped back outside, secured the entry door, and placed a call to his supervisor. The investigation that followed began with a county judge, a search warrant application based on the deputy's documented observations, and a phone call made by the county sheriff's office that afternoon to a federal contact in the regional field office that handled export control and trade compliance cases. The federal contact arrived the following morning. What the full search of Unit 7 uncovered over the course of the following 2 days was, in the assessment of federal investigators, a node in a procurement and transshipment network that had been operating in the region for a period of approximately 5 years. The hard-sided cases contained electronic components, microprocessors, oscilloscopes, signal generation equipment, fiber optic components, and several items that federal export control specialists identified within hours as dual-use technology subject to strict export licensing requirements under federal law. None of the items in the unit had been associated with valid export licenses. All had been sourced through what investigators would subsequently describe as a structured procurement chain designed to acquire controlled technology through domestic commercial channels and routed outward through a layered transshipment network that obscured both the ultimate destination and the end user. The freight documentation files in the unit, when fully analyzed, revealed an operation of considerable sophistication. The registered business had functioned, on its legitimate surface, as a genuine small trade documentation consultancy. It had real clients, processed real freight paperwork, and generated real commercial revenue that provided financial cover for its underlying activities. Beneath that surface, it had served for at least 3 years as a procurement relay and document preparation point, acquiring controlled technology components through domestic purchasing networks, processing shipping documentation that misrepresented the goods, their destination, and their end user, and staging the materials at the Millward Business Park unit for periodic collection by a chain of freight intermediaries whose routing ultimately federal investigators established over the weeks following the initial discovery led to entities in third countries with documented connections to state-directed technology acquisition programs. The technology being moved, the documentation methods, the layered intermediary structure, the geographic routing. Federal investigators with experience in export enforcement cases assessed the operational profile as consistent with state-sponsored procurement methodology. Not improvised smuggling, but a structured program with access to professional expertise in commercial documentation, export control regulatory frameworks, and financial routing. The kind of operation, one investigator noted in materials that became part of the public record in subsequent proceedings, that required not just criminal motivation, but institutional knowledge, The occupant of the unit, the principal of the registered trade logistics company, was not on the premises at the time of the initial inspection or the subsequent warranted search. He was located 2 days later at a hotel in a city roughly 4 hours from Denton Falls and taken into custody without incident. He was a naturalized citizen in his early 50s who had lived in the region for 11 years, operated several small businesses in succession, and had, for that period, assembled the profile of a moderately successful regional trade consultant with community connections and a professional reputation that gave him legitimate access to the commercial and logistical networks that the operation required. Federal charges were filed within 72 hours. The charges included export control violations, conspiracy to illegally export controlled technology, money laundering, and a series of related counts that federal prosecutors continued to refine as the investigation expanded. Court documents filed in the initial proceedings described the operation as connected to a foreign government's organized program of technology acquisition through commercial front entities. The specific characterization used in the charging documents was that the operation had been conducted on behalf of, and in coordination with, entities acting at the direction of a foreign state. But the federal case and the arrest of the unit's principal were not the end of the investigation's reach into Denton Falls. Among the freight documentation records recovered from Unit 7, and among the digital records extracted from computing devices seized as part of the warranted search, investigators found a category of files that the federal team flagged within the first week and brought back to the county sheriff's office with a specific inquiry. A series of records documenting customs processing activity that should not have been as smooth as it had been. An import and export operation moving controlled goods through falsified documentation will, at various points in its supply chain, encounter federal customs scrutiny. The normal expectation is that misdeclared goods, inconsistent documentation, or shipment profiles that match known enforcement criteria will trigger secondary review, physical inspection, or hold orders at points of customs entry. The Denton Falls operation had moved materials for at least 3 years through domestic freight channels. Some of those channels passed through federally monitored transit points. The records suggested a pattern. Documentation that should have triggered review had not triggered review. Shipments that should have been held had cleared. The processing timestamps on certain customs-adjacent records were, in the assessment of investigators, inconsistent with the normal operational tempo of routine customs processing and consistent instead with facilitated clearance. The kind of processing speed that results when someone with access to the relevant systems ensures that certain files move without the scrutiny they would otherwise receive. The second investigation, a federal internal affairs inquiry running parallel to the Denton Falls case, concluded after 9 weeks with an arrest that the federal agency involved announced in a joint statement with the county sheriff's office. A mid-level customs processing officer assigned to a federal port of entry facility approximately 90 miles from Denton Falls had been with his agency for 14 years. He had an unremarkable service record. He had not been the subject of prior complaints or disciplinary action. He was, by the functional account of his colleagues and supervisors, a competent and unobtrusive federal employee who processed his assigned documentation workload and did his job without drawing attention. He was known, in the community where he had lived for 12 years, as a reliable neighbor and a regular presence at the weekend farmers market, where he bought vegetables and exchanged the brief pleasantries of suburban proximity with people who had no reason to look at him with anything other than ordinary familiarity. For a period of approximately 4 years, beginning roughly 1 year after the Denton Falls Trade Logistics Company was established and the Millward Business Park unit was first leased, this officer had accepted payments routed through the same intermediary financial network that funded the operation's procurement activities. The payments had been structured to avoid automatic financial monitoring thresholds and channeled through a sequence of commercial transactions that forensic accountants described in court filings as a professional money routing architecture rather than improvised concealment. The total received was estimated at $260,000 over the full period of the arrangement. In exchange, the officer had provided a specific and precisely defined service. When shipment documentation associated with the operation's supply chain reached his processing queue, identified through a coding system embedded in the freight documentation that he had been trained to recognize. He ensured that those files were processed without secondary referral. In cases where automated systems flagged items for review, he had override authority as a mid-level officer to clear flags with a documented justification notation. He had exercised that authority on behalf of the network on at least 31 documented occasions over 4 years. On 7 additional occasions, he had identified incoming inspections by other officers that would have intersected with shipment windows, and had rerouted the inspection scheduling through legitimate administrative channels in ways that moved the inspection timing past the relevant window. 31 documented clearances, 7 rerouted inspections, 14 years of service, a farmer's market on weekends, a customs processing officer who had been, in every exterior dimension, exactly the kind of unremarkable federal public servant who processes thousands of shipments a year and generates no attention whatsoever. The investigation's reach ultimately extended into 6 states and involved multiple federal agencies. The financial network underlying the operation, used to fund procurement, route payments to the customs officer, and launder the consultancy's operational revenues into the legitimate commercial record, was traced through a structure of shell entities, business accounts, and individual financial relationships that federal prosecutors described in court filings as an architecture built for permanence rather than speed. It had been designed to survive scrutiny, to look ordinary under examination, and to continue functioning even if individual nodes were compromised. Denton Falls learned about the discovery through a public statement issued by the county sheriff's office in coordination with federal partners approximately 2 weeks after the initial inspection. The statement was careful, measured, and appropriately limited given the scope of ongoing proceedings. It noted that a routine property inspection by a county deputy had initiated an investigation that resulted in federal charges, that community members had no specific safety concerns arising from the discovery, and that the sheriff's office was committed to full cooperation with the federal investigation. The town absorbed the information with the particular kind of disquiet that comes from discovering that something invisible had been present and operating. Unit 7 at Millward Business Park had been there for 3 years. The beige corrugated steel panel had been part of the view from the county road for 3 years. The vans had come and gone in the early mornings and the late evenings for 3 years, and the only person who had noticed that the pattern was wrong was a woman who had watched the same parking apron from 2 units down for 9 years and knew that something had changed. The county reviewed its commercial license inspection protocols following the case and established a new framework for cross-referencing registered business profiles against observed operational activity, a change that, the sheriff's office noted in its internal after-action report, would make it harder for a future operation to sustain a documented commercial profile that diverged significantly from its actual activity for an extended period without generating inquiry. The business park is still operating. Unit 7 has a new tenant, a small electrical supply distributor that generates ordinary activity at ordinary hours. The neighbors know its trucks. The pattern is the same every week. What the woman in Unit 5 noticed was not dramatic. It was not loud. It was not visible in the way that most people imagine threats to be visible. It was trucks at the wrong time of day, and a pattern that had quietly stopped making sense. She wrote it down and sent it to the county. A deputy drove out to check. The door was not fully latched. He knocked and no one answered, and he looked at what was visible from where he was standing and decided it was worth a phone call. That is what Sheriff Patrol follows. The moment when a routine inspection becomes something else, when the details that trained eyes notice accumulate into a case, when the ordinary entry point, a neighbor's complaint, an unlatched door, a stack of locked cases along a wall, opens into something that had been carefully engineered to never be found. The hardware store is still on Main Street. The diner still has the same breakfast special it has served since 1987. Denton Falls is the same town it was before the discovery at Millward Business Park, except that it knows now what can operate in a beige corrugated steel unit at the end of a commercial row, when the right people are in place to make sure nobody looks too closely. This is a fictional dramatization inspired by law enforcement concepts and publicly documented investigative patterns. No real cases, individuals, or specific locations are depicted. All characters, addresses, and community details are entirely invented.